If you grew up in the 90s, one thing was very clear. Dinosaurs are awesome. Between Dinosaurs the TV show, Power Rangers with their Dinozords, and, of course, Jurassic Park, you were well catered for, even if you only had a passing interest in dinosaurs, which, let's face it, most kids do. But like my Power Rangers series, where I take a look at what we got in the West and compare it to its original reference material, yes, the next one is coming. Jurassic Park the movie also wasn't original. It was based on the book of the same name by Michael Crichton. But how similar is it to the book? Well, let's find out, as we, once again, ask, what's the difference? The first thing to point out is that the story of the first book is actually very similar, which you'd expect, as Michael Crichton also wrote the screenplay. But throughout the process, a number of changes are notable. Let me take you through it. The beginning of the book wouldn't feel very familiar to anyone who'd only seen the movie. It mentions animals that have already escaped the island, and there are sightings on Costa Rica too. A baby is killed by small compies, and a girl is attacked on a beach while on holiday. Now that part was originally going to be part of the script, and it was conceptualized and included, but was removed later in further revisions. However, we would see it at the beginning of the second movie, The Lost World, but that's on Isla Sorna, the Site B island, as opposed to Costa Rica. A sample of a dead and torn dinosaur is collected and sent for analysis, but it's mostly ignored to begin with. It's only when things aren't adding up that Alan Grant is contacted for his opinion. Now, obviously none of this happens in the movie. Instead, we get an opening scene of a raptor being moved and a park worker getting killed. This is sort of a shortened version of something that does happen in the book, but it's actually something that happens off-screen, so to speak. There's a chapter about a worker being flown for medical help, but they describe his injuries as being caused by a backhoe. As he's dying though, he's able to tell the doctor, raptor. A lot of the beginning of the book is about setting the scene that there's a conspiracy around these animals having escaped Jurassic Park or are attacking workers, but it's all being covered up. It's only really when we get to the second iteration, or chapter 6, that we get to the point of introducing Alan Grant and his dig site, which is where the movie really starts. Hammond comes to the dig site that he's also helping to fund in order to persuade Alan and his research partner Ellie to come to his island and give their approval. But in the book, we also learn that Hammond is already under investigation from the Environmental Protection Agency, as is Lewis Dodgson from a rival company called Biosyn. Biosyn was reckless and caused disasters like releasing vaccines that actually contained live, active versions of viruses. Dodgson isn't interested in doing legitimate research, he tends to take illegitimate shortcuts or just steal other people's work.
Dodgson! Dodgson! We've got Dodgson here! See, nobody cares.
In the movie, we see the handoff of the first money payment to Dennis Nedgery for stealing viable embryos and transporting them in a tricked-out can of Barbasol, oddly changed from Gillette in the book. But Dodgson doesn't really feature again. In the movie, we don't get a whole lot of information about who Dodgson is or why he wants the embryos. In the book, it's because, true to character, he wants to undercut Hammond's company, InGen, but will arguably go even further in merchandising of the creatures created, by even making dinosaur pets for kids. They could always try and reverse engineer some of InGen's research years down the line, but why bother when they could just steal it now and get a head start? And while we don't see Dodgson again on screen, he does come back around in the second book. In order to get the thumbs up from investors, Hammond has convinced Alan Grant, paleontologist, Ellie Sattler, paleobotanist, and Ian Malcolm, mathematician, to sign off on everything. Now, straight away, Jeff Goldblum's take on Malcolm is much more charming than his literary counterpart. In the book, Malcolm is a bit of an insufferable know-it-all arse. That's not to say he's wrong about many things, he's just not particularly likeable. He seems to take real pleasure in making other people feel stupid. But, as we'll come to see, Unlikable characters are actually quite a common theme in the book. Once on the island, we get the great realization that Hammond has actually managed to do it. He's recreated dinosaurs, albeit genetically modified.
You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
In the book, we get a very long-winded explanation of how this is done. It goes into ridiculous amounts of detail, right down to the amount of computer storage required to house the DNA sequences, as well as the computing power required to both sequence it, identify problems, and then fix those problems. But it doesn't stop there. It also goes into specific enzymes used to cut segments out of broken sequences and how they splice in new segments, but then have to go through the long process of trial and error to see if it results in a viable animal. And all the non-viable mistakes that occur along the way that either die or have to be culled, an important point for book 2. In the movie though, they dumb it down massively, but they do it in a very clever way. Rather than insulting us as the audience, or the characters in the film, they explain it using the introduction video that Hammond would use for his public guests. It establishes Hammond as a likable and charming character, and explains the science in a simple enough way that we could all understand it without feeling like we've been talked down to. As rather than being dumbed down for us, it's for the fictional park guests, presumably including children. And then of course the actual scientists are left unsatisfied and wanting to know more, so they break free from the ride to find out. There's no need for any of that in the book, as Dr. Wu is more than happy to disclose as much information as is asked of him, mainly because he's very proud of what he's achieved and wants the park to be signed off so that he can one day publish all of his findings. Even though the movie mentions that all the animals are female, in the book they've also been sterilized with radiation, and they are completely lysine dependent, so require a very specific diet controlled by Jurassic Park. If they leave the island, they'll die. That last part is mentioned, but it's of greater importance in the book because, as we already know, they've already escaped. And indeed, at the beginning of the sequel, the Lost World book, it claims that the animals that have escaped have learned to eat food high in lysine to counteract the genetic modification. But there's even more detail in the first book, because they talk about InGen buying up a company that produces artificial eggshells, specifically avian-like eggs made out of a patented plastic. There is some sort of explanation in the movie, but it's muffled, and all we really hear is something about unfertilized ostrich eggs. And make no mistake, the book will constantly hammer home that dinosaurs are more bird-like. They mostly ignore this in the film because it would get confusing when we're meant to focus on the use of amphibian DNA to fix broken segments, as this is partly used to explain why they can begin to breed, given that some amphibians are able to change their sex, as required for the survival of the species. While the film never explicitly goes into detail about the animals breeding, it is mentioned and it's subtly foreshadowed that 2 female animals could somehow find a way to make it work, with the 2 female ends of Alan Grant's seatbelt finding a way to be somewhat functional.
You're implying that a group composed entirely of female animals will breed?
No, I'm simply saying that life finds a way.
And this is actually quite an important point, because once the animals do start to breed, in the book, Grant insists that they go find the raptor nest because he wants to figure out just how many animals there are on the island before it all gets destroyed, and how many have been created and or born. To be honest, I'm not really sure I understand his motivation for this, as realistically, that doesn't make any sense, as there'd be no way of figuring out how many had died, been eaten, or escaped. But the book goes into quite a lot of detail about how the animals are tracked. It's not through tagging, it's through an AI-controlled CCTV system, whereby the computer recognizes species and comes up with a count for all the dinosaurs on the island. But they screwed up by setting the limit as the number they'd expect, when in fact there's actually more. So honestly, there's no need for them to go after any nests at all, and it makes sense that none of that is included in the movie, although you do get a sense that they used some of it in Jurassic Park 3. But But it explains why Hammond can be insistent that no animals have escaped, because his computer system was telling him that the expected number of dinosaurs were still on the island, when in actual fact, some had escaped and the number in the park was likely higher than expected. But you see, in the book, Grant has got a particular interest in young dinosaurs, including eggs. That's why he's researching in Montana, and it leads to a full circle moment when he goes raptor hunting in the visitor center after they enter the building, killing them by getting them to eat eggs that have been injected with poison. But again, none of that is in the movie. It was conceptualized, but didn't make it to the final script. Instead, we saw a different take on combating raptors in the building. In fact, going back a bit, the movie goes in a completely different direction and adds a scene with a raptor hatching when they first learn of the technology, with Hammond being there to help it, again establishing him as a likable character, as he wants to be like a mother figure, having each dinosaur see him before anyone else does so that they don't see humans as a threat. Understandably, they don't make any mention of the genetic disasters that may not have worked out so well. There is a segment with a baby raptor in the book, but it's Tim, Hammond's grandson, that is interacting with it. Hammond isn't there for any births, and it does come back later in the book, but that baby ends up getting eaten, so again, probably best it was cut from the film. Although, the idea that Hammond is there for all infant births is nonsense anyway, once we learn the plot for the second movie, but we'll get to that. In fact, this is where the movie deviates most from the book, because in the book, Hammond is, to say the very least, unlikable. In the movie, it's Gennaro that's the bad guy. He's the one that's made into a money-grubbing lawyer, making his death on the toilet all the more satisfying. But in actual fact, Gennaro doesn't die in the book. You see, he's the legal counsel for InGen, but he represents a firm of investors that owns 5% of Jurassic Park. Now that Jurassic Park is under investigation from the EPA and may fail, that would represent a huge loss in money. That's why he wants independent experts to come and sign off the park. While that part is more or less the same in the movie, when the characters have realised what Jurassic Park is all about and start to talk about some of the business logistics, Gennaro is the lone wolf talking about money and being able to charge whatever they want. Whereas Hammond interrupts him and specifically says that the park is not intended to cater to the super rich. However, in the book, Hammond is the one that's money grubbing. Gennaro just wants to make sure the park is financially viable, whereas the movie makes Hammond out to be almost a philanthropist with no expense spared. Although well-meaning, that's not to say Hammond isn't foolhardy in his approach, as Malcolm points out, as he does in the book too, but the movie version of Hammond isn't sinister. Although, again, with some later knowledge, he doesn't appear particularly honest either. The book version of Hammond, well, for him, it is all about the money. Despite being in his late 70s, he's fast-tracked Jurassic Park's growth in order to make his fortune even bigger. He goes on a whole monologue about why should he use his fortune to help mankind, like helping research into miracle drugs. He'll never see a return on his investment. The governments of the world will deny him patents and make it impossible to charge whatever price he wants because it would be seen as immoral. But if it's entertainment, well, no one needs entertainment, so he could make something that everyone will want to see, and no one will stop him charging whatever he wants to. In fact, the whole concept of it being unaffordable for most will make it all the more desirable. Anyone visiting Jurassic Park will be part of an exclusive elite club. This first Jurassic Park is for the American elite, but they've already got new islands in the Azores for the Europeans and in Guam for the Japanese. His target is $20 billion a year in profit, despite the fact he'd probably be too old to even spend it. But that is his concern. Unprecedented wealth and fame. That's what he wants, not to share something special with the world at any expense. But what's interesting is that despite all of that, he also wants to preserve the realness of the dinosaurs. Even though they're not real anyway, they're genetically modified, as is pointed out to him. Although it might just be an excuse as a cost consideration, as he doesn't want to replace the entire stock of animals. It's Wu that wants to change the animals so that they're not like the actual dinosaurs were. He wants them to be slower, more docile, so that people going on the tour can actually see them. And really, they wouldn't know the difference anyway. This is somewhat hinted at in the movie when they're going past enclosures but can't see anything. And it's more or less the main plot point in Jurassic World, where they make a designer dinosaur more impressive than any that ever existed, because that's seen as more interesting and exciting than the actual dinosaurs. Back to the movie, and despite the reservations of all three of the scientist guests, Hammond welcomes his grandchildren, Tim and Lex. They all get into some Ford Explorers, not Toyota Land Cruisers like in the book, and head out onto the tour. But not before further establishing how much Grant does not like children. Now, in the book, he does like children. He likes how enthusiastic they are, particularly Tim. But they changed this in the movie, presumably because Grant spends most of his time alone with both Tim and Lex, and it makes more sense from a character development perspective to have to go from not liking children to having to become a father-like figure once things start to go wrong. The only thing is, to make all that possible, they had to completely change the character of Lex. Because in the book, she is without doubt the most insufferable child you will ever come across. All she does is moan about being bored or hungry and whines when she doesn't get what she wants. She even makes Alan carry her when he's got a broken leg. If there was a moment of redemption, then you could forgive all the awfulness. But no, she's terrible throughout the entire book. At one point, after having gone through an entire ordeal, nearly being eaten on multiple occasions, they go back to the visitor centre and start raiding the canteen. While this is a sweet moment in the movie, not so much in the book, as she's moaning about wanting ice cream rather than candy bars. Admittedly, she's the younger of the two in the book, but even so, you find yourself hoping that an 8-year-old girl gets gruesomely killed. In the movie, they make her both likeable and smart. In the book, she's pretty much an idiot. It's Tim that's the dinosaur genius, and also good at computers. Whereas in the movie, they at least give Lex the computer smarts, which are vital later in the story. In the second book, they make both children smart, but in different ways. While on the tour, they stop to help an ill Triceratops, although in the book, it's a Stegosaurus. But again, the book goes into a lot of detail about dinosaur theory and how they're more bird-like. The film did have a Stegosaurus as one of the storyboard options, but apparently there were multiple storyboard versions, and the scriptwriters went with the Triceratops instead. When Steven Spielberg saw how much work had gone into the robotics of the Triceratops, he told Sam Neill to improvise some of the interactions with it, like leaning on it as it breathes. A touch of realism that you just wouldn't get with CG. And it's a standout moment from the film that still looks good today. Later, a storm rolls in, while Nedry implements his plan to steal the embryos, turning off many of the security systems to cover his escape. Not that it helps him, because he ends up getting blinded and eaten by the Dilophosaurus. And then, of course, we get the Tyrannosaurus attack, where Gennaro leaves Tim and Lex in the car, which is partly destroyed, before Malcolm is injured and Gennaro eaten. This isn't quite how it happens in the book. It's a different character, Ed Regis, that abandons the children. He's not in the film, but he's not really necessary. And he ends up getting eaten by the juvenile T-Rex, but it's all merged together in the film to make it more streamlined. And after all, big dinosaur is more impressive than small dinosaur. Now, there's actually a moment in the film that often gets confused, and that's that the Tyrannosaurus breaks through the fence, only for moments later, Grant, Tim, Lex, and one of the cars to somehow be falling from a great height. And admittedly, it is a bit confusing from the way the film shows it, but of course, the answer is sort of in the book. It's that the enclosures don't just have big fences, they also have giant trenches. It's sort of easy to understand why they'd be designed like that. It's presumably got something to do with a hill or platform that's designed to have the goat on it so that people can watch the T-Rex eat. But then it would be weird then that you'd only have an electric fence separating the apex predator from the humans in the tour cars making loads of noise and movement. And I don't really get it, but there are other channels that have attempted to explain it. To be fair though, even the screenwriters knew it was difficult to understand. David Koepp said, "Over the barrier there is a gentle terraced area at one side where the Rex emerged from, but the car isn't next to that, it's next to a sharp precipice, representing a 50 or 60 foot drop. Then the T-Rex attacks and the car starts to spin around, and they're shoved to the edge of what is now a perilous cliff that has never been there before." But when he asked Steven Spielberg whether the audience would question this, he simply pointed at the life-size animatronic T-Rex as to what people's main focus would be in the scene. After the car has fallen over the cliff and into the enclosure, Grant is then left to journey through the park with the children. But this is very different from the book. The action is completely changed. For example, the running with the Gallimimus is completely unique to the film. In the book, Grant has a broken leg, but there is a scene in which they take a raft from a storage shed and the Tyrannosaurus, the adult one, enters a river to hunt him, Lex and Tim, with it swimming or more like walking on the riverbed towards their raft. They're only saved when the baby T-Rex tries to steal some food, so the adult gets distracted and chases the baby away. This may have been cut as it would have been too difficult to film, but it feels quite similar to a scene from Jurassic Park 3. The whole scene with the electric fence is also an invention of the film as well, but it's probably needed to replace the point that Tim nearly gets eaten in the book. There's also other interactions like Lex riding a baby Triceratops that she calls Ralph, which is completely absent from the first film, although we kind of see a nod to this in Jurassic World, when the park is now open and they're offering rides on baby Triceratops in a kids' petting zoo. To get the systems back online, it's proposed they must do a hard reboot. This is more or less the same in the book, although there is a fair few more steps in the book than in the movie. They do also mention the lysine contingency here and what its purpose is, but this seems to be more mentioned in reference to protecting Grant and the children. I'm not quite sure what the reference is here. Stop feeding them so all the dinosaurs die, presumably. This is where Muldoon is killed, which is an invention of the film too. In fact, Muldoon survives in the book, but then we'd be robbed of the clever girl scene.
Clever girl.
The whole locking the raptor in the freezer bit is in the book, but most of Grant's raptor hunting is cut from the film. Instead, they focus on Lex getting the power back on, whereas in the book, it's Tim that gets it going again, with Lex moaning at him the whole time, as she does best. But then the kids run things from the command center while there's a lot of killing going on elsewhere. But of course, in the film, it's the ultimate redemption for Grant's dislike of children because they become more important members of the team. In the book, it specifically states that Grant's feelings were that it was impossible not to like any group so openly enthusiastic about dinosaurs. But in the film, they needed to give him more of a character arc, so his first interaction is with an obnoxious kid who needs to be put in his place a little bit. And then when they get to the park, at first he finds the children annoying and tries to avoid them. But as the film goes on, we see the gradual warming to them and the bonding that takes place during their time together. Until, at the end of the film, he's like a proud father figure to Lex and Tim. They eventually escape the raptors because the T-Rex comes in and starts eating them, and Hammond is able to call for a helicopter to get them all to safety. Of course, that's not how it goes down in the book. Hammond falls, breaking his ankle, and is eaten alive by compies. And then the military comes in, gets the survivors out by helicopter, and blows everything up, destroying everything on the island. But despite the differences, the film is still relatively faithful to the book. They cut some stuff here and there, they merge a few characters and make some of the characters more likable, all of which makes sense. The movie may be the dumbed down version, but for the action sci-fi horror that it is, I can understand why. And at the end of the day, how can you be mad at a film so good? Which is all the more strange that the Lost World book has very little to do with the movie. Now, this can be a whole video of its own, but the only real similarity is that there is a Site B, Isla Sorna, which was the main manufacturing facility for the dinosaurs, and they're now all roaming free. There are a few things that cross over, like the overly advanced research bus and parts of the scene where there's an injured baby Tyrannosaurus, but generally speaking, it's a completely different story. And we have to bear in mind that this was written after the success of the first film, and Michael Crichton didn't want to write the screenplay for the second film. In fact, he didn't even want to write the book. He had been pressured by fans and also by Steven Spielberg, but he didn't like the idea of sequels because he wasn't sure how to find the right balance of it being the same, but different. And to be fair, that really does show. For example, the Lost World book also has two young children, a boy and a girl, called Arby and Kelly. Arby being a super smart hacker type who gains access to the computer systems on the island to assist the adults. If you included this in a movie, the audience would just say that it's lazy writing and move on. In a movie sequel, you need to up the ante. In short, Ian Malcolm initially agrees to remain silent about Jurassic Park because he needed the medical payoff to cope with his injuries, but he begins working with someone called Levine when they learn that there could be a Site B. With InGen now bankrupt, the mega-rich Levine buys computers and other equipment in a clearance sale and manages to recover some of the deleted files. Levine has an ego and insists on going to the potential Site B before the rest of the expedition is ready, partly because Dodgson from Biosyn, the guys that tried to get Dennis Nedgery to steal the embryos, is also onto it and has been spying on Malcolm, ready to follow them and steal embryos. Again. Although, it's not really stealing this time around, as InGen is gone, but predictably it goes wrong and they have to rescue Levine. The kids sneak onto the research bus, which kind of happens in the movie, but basically Site B is the factory floor of Jurassic Park. It's where the majority of the research and the dirty work of genetic engineering took place, somewhat similar to the film. They're later joined by Sarah Harding from an expedition in Africa, and the goal is basically to observe the dinosaurs in a natural environment to try and better understand their evolution and extinction. But if you haven't already noticed, that has nothing to do with the film. In fact, other than the establishment of Site B, the beginning of the film couldn't be more different. Hammond is still alive, but has lost control of InGen, which is still around, but he doesn't have control. Malcolm breaks his NDA and is actively trying to tell the world about what happened at Jurassic Park, and absolutely wants nothing to do with Site B. But Hammond wants him to go so that they can get pictures of all the dinosaurs, not just for research purposes, but so he can save InGen's dwindling finances and not have his greedy nephew take control and make a theme park, which is actually from the first book. Arby is removed and merged with Kelly, who is now Malcolm's daughter. Meanwhile, Sarah Harding is already on the island and they're there to rescue her. Richard Levine is not in the movie. Lewis Dodgson, not in the movie. Biosyn, not in the movie. In fact, the Lost World book even has an entire segment dedicated to debunking the whole T-Rexes can't see you if you stand still myth. One of Dodgson's associates gets eaten because they assumed it to be true and they were wrong, but obviously that robs the movies of one of their staple tropes.
Nobody move a muscle.
The Lost World movie just dives straight into the action, which is not actually much of a surprise because a child fan of the first movie sent a letter to scriptwriters saying, as long as you have the T-Rex and the Velociraptor, everything else is fine. But whatever you do, don't have a long, boring part at the beginning that has nothing to do with the island. And yeah, a big part of the Lost World book is kind of boring. A lot of the scientific babble is important for context in the first book, but it gets tiresome in the second. The characters go on long, rambling monologues about extinction and evolutionary theory. It's interesting, but if you're expecting a thrilling story, you'll be disappointed. It's like Michael Crichton did an enormous amount of research for the first book and then just created a story to fit around all the stuff that didn't make it into Jurassic Park. It was an excuse to write his own thoughts about extinction and evolution, but needed the security of putting it in the mouths of fictional characters. A lot of it feels like an extended epilogue rather than a sequel, which, given his reluctancy to write the book in the first place, for that very reason, makes sense. As an example, at 200 or so pages into the book, all that has happened in the story is that Malcolm and Levine have formed a reluctant partnership. Levine has found Site B and head there on his own. The rest of the team follow him because they thought he needed help, but didn't actually want it. He's happily chasing T-Rexes on a push bike, and Dodgson has found where they are and pursued them. That's it. That's fine as a setup for the plot, but it's 60 to 70% of the book. You really have to persevere if you want to get to the action in the latter 30%, which does deliver and turn Sarah into the real action hero, but you really have to wait for it. And besides, Ian Malcolm is high on morphine for much of it, but at least you have Levine, who is just as obnoxious. Which is the whole problem. Arby and Kelly are too much like Tim and Lex, and Levine is too much like Malcolm, and essentially everybody that dies gets eaten by raptors, T-Rexes or compies, like the first time around. There is great action in it, but it's not enough for a whole film. Say what you want about the Lost World movie, but they did what they could with such little material. Most of the book is just Levine or Malcolm delivering lectures to the kids. If they'd made the Lost World book into a movie, it would have been an enormous box office flop. There are a few bits that are similar. The character of Eddie kind of fits within the book, although he's a merger of both the book version of Eddie and also his boss, Thorn. And then, even though it's a different character and the scenario is entirely different, Dodgson is half-eaten by compies, which there is a scene it kind of fits, but it's not the same. Although, to be fair, the book does have you covered on that one, as Dodgson is eventually horrifically eaten by a T-Rex parent and its children. The most faithful scene from the book is the trailers being attacked by the T-Rexes and pushing them off a cliff after the baby is being treated. But just about everything else has changed. The bulk of the story in the movie is about Hammond's nephew hunting for animals for his theme park, leading to the grand finale with the T-Rex escaping and running through San Diego, which no doubt had an influence on the US Godzilla movie. The takeaway from the book is that the team managed to get cameras up and running so that they can observe all the animals in their lost world, but it's all for naught because they're infected and very few are living to adulthood, plus there's too many predators. The dinosaurs on the island will go extinct, and Malcolm and Levine will learn nothing from it. There certainly won't be any companies doing parasailing drive-bys for too long. It's actually quite strange seeing just how similar the first book is to the movie, and then how different the second one is. But in a way, I kind of see these like the Alien franchise. The first movie is essentially a sci-fi horror movie, whereas the second is a big blockbuster action movie. They have their merits, but it's the first one that has a bit more integrity from a cinematic perspective. Either way, if you're prepared to wade through the mass of pseudoscience that the first book throws at you, then I'd recommend diving in, as whether or not it has any scientific merit, it makes the whole thing seem more plausible, which when you go back to the movie, you have a greater appreciation for what's going on between the lines of the screenplay. It makes a masterpiece of a film that much more magical. But when it comes to the second book, you really don't need either as a companion to the other. The film is a summer blockbuster popcorn muncher from a director that regretted a fair few decisions he made, and the book is a relatively clumsy sequel from an author that didn't want to write it in the first place. That's not to say that they aren't worth your time, but it does show, and as a result, there's no beating the originals. But that's the end of the video, and until next time, I'll see you all later. Bye.